Here's one from Brett. It said, you say you don't like your feet. Why? And it says, show why. What's wrong with your feet?
Do you want me to show you for real?
All right, let's see. What's wrong with your feet?
Okay, seriously, my feet are really bad.
Before we get into the scene itself, it's worth clearing something up, because the premise of this story gets exaggerated online more than almost any other piece of British television history. Fawlty Towers was never cancelled, banned, or pulled from broadcast because of a single scene. It ran its complete, intended run of 12 episodes across 2 series, and John Cleese and Connie Booth were the ones who chose to stop, not the BBC. What actually happened is something narrower, more recent, and honestly stranger than a cancellation. One specific episode was temporarily yanked from a streaming platform decades after it first aired, and the reason wasn't the scene most people assume. So let's walk through how this show came to exist in the first place, what actually happened during that infamous episode, and then get into the real, documented story of how it briefly vanished from view. The origin of Fawlty Towers starts nowhere near a writer's room. It starts in a real hotel, in a real English seaside town, with a real man whose behavior was strange enough that a comedy legend took notes on him like he was conducting field research. In 1970, the Monty Python team was staying in Torquay while filming location work for Flying Circus, and their hotel was the Gleneagles, run by a man named Donald Sinclair. Sinclair wasn't just brusque or old-fashioned. By most accounts from the people who stayed there, he was bizarre in ways that bordered on the surreal. He reportedly hurled a guest's suitcase over a garden wall because he suspected it might contain a bomb, when in reality it was simply luggage that had been left unattended in the lobby. He was said to have scolded a guest for using a knife and fork the wrong way, treating basic table manners like a serious offense. Complaints from guests weren't met with the usual apologetic hotel manager routine, but with irritation directed back at the guests themselves, as if their expectations were the actual problem. Most travelers would have just switched hotels or left an angry note. John Cleese, instead, found the whole thing fascinating, and he later credited that stay as the direct inspiration for Basil Fawlty. Sinclair died in 1981, reportedly without ever fully realizing that his approach to hospitality had been immortalized on national television. Cleese didn't turn that experience into a show by himself. He developed it with his then-wife and creative partner Connie Booth, and the two of them shaped Sinclair's real-life chaos into something tighter and funnier than a simple impression of a rude hotelier. Basil Fawlty wasn't written as a villain. He was written as a deeply insecure man obsessed with class and status, desperate to run a respectable establishment for a better class of guest, while being constitutionally incapable of actually pulling that off. Every episode put him under pressure and watched him crack in a slightly different way, with his wife Sybil, played by Prunella Scales, serving as the one person who could deflate him with a single look, and Manuel, played by Andrew Sachs, absorbing the fallout of nearly every one of Basil's schemes gone wrong. When the show premiered on BBC in 1975, the response from critics was lukewarm at best. Some genuinely found it too chaotic and frantic to sit comfortably alongside the more traditional sitcoms of the era. Audiences disagreed almost immediately, and the show built momentum through repeats rather than its initial run. Only 12 episodes were ever produced, spread across a 1975 series and a second series in 1979, but that small body of work was enough to eventually earn Fawlty Towers the top spot in a British Film Institute poll ranking the greatest British television programs of all time. Now to the episode at the center of this story, The Germans, which aired as part of the first series in October 1975 and has become, for better and worse, the single most talked about half-hour the show ever produced. The setup finds Basil recovering from a concussion after being struck on the head, which leaves him even less capable than usual of controlling himself, right as a group of German tourists checks into the hotel. Desperate not to cause offense, he orders his staff not to mention the war under any circumstances, and then almost immediately begins doing exactly that himself, spiraling into a rambling, increasingly unhinged monologue that culminates in him goose-stepping through the dining room doing an impression of Adolf Hitler in front of his mortified guests. It's one of the most quoted set pieces in British sitcom history, and it works because the joke has always been aimed squarely at Basil. He's the one humiliating himself. He's the one who cannot let go of a national obsession that has nothing to do with the actual people standing in front of him. Cleese has been consistent about this point for decades. The The target of the scene was British wartime fixation and Basil's own arrogance, not the German guests, who are simply bewildered bystanders in someone else's meltdown. But the Hitler impression isn't actually the part of the episode that caused the real, documented controversy. That distinction belongs to a much less quoted section of the Germans, involving a recurring supporting character named Major Goen, played by Ballard Berkeley, an elderly, senile long-term hotel guest. In a conversation with Basil about the incoming German guests, the Major goes on a tangent about a cricket match and uses genuinely offensive, racist language to describe West Indian and Indian players. Unlike Basil's Hitler bit, which is broad physical satire clearly designed to make him look ridiculous, the Major's lines don't carry the same obvious punchline structure. The character is presented as a relic of a bygone, casually bigoted era, and the scene has always been more uncomfortable to sit through than uproarious, which is exactly why it became the flashpoint decades later rather than the war-themed material everyone remembers first. That flashpoint arrived in June 2020, not in 1975. In the weeks following the death of George Floyd in the United States, a wave of anti-racism protests spread globally, and media companies across the UK and US began reassessing older programs for content that hadn't aged well. It was in that specific climate that UK TV, a streaming service jointly owned by the BBC, made the decision to temporarily remove the Germans from its platform. A UK TV spokesperson stated plainly that the episode contained racial slurs and that the company was taking it down while it carried out a review, adding that older content is regularly reassessed to make sure it still meets audience expectations. This wasn't a vague, symbolic gesture. The language attributed to the Major, particularly the way he refers to Caribbean cricketers, was the specific material UK TV cited as the problem. The removal made international headlines within hours, partly because Fawlty Towers is considered such a foundational piece of British comedy, and partly because it landed in the middle of an already heated global conversation about which older media should be reassessed and how. John Cleese did not stay quiet about it. He publicly and repeatedly criticized the decision, arguing that the people who pulled the episode had fundamentally misread what the scene was doing. His core argument was one he'd made about the show for years. There are two ways to satirize prejudice, either by attacking it head-on, or by putting it in the mouth of a character who is obviously meant to be a fool, and letting the audience laugh at him rather than with him. He characterized the Major as squarely the second kind of character, someone the show was mocking, not endorsing, and he described the decision to remove the episode in blunt terms, criticizing the corporate and bureaucratic instincts he felt were driving it. His comments were picked up by outlets across the UK, Europe, and beyond, and the story briefly became genuinely international, drawing enough attention that even political figures in other countries were asked about it during unrelated press conferences. The removal, though, was never permanent, and this is the part that gets left out when this story gets turned into clickbait. Within days, UK TV announced it would reinstate the Germans, this time accompanied by a warning about offensive content and language. That basic approach, keeping the episode available but attaching a content advisory, matched how other platforms were already handling it. BritBox and Netflix, for instance, had continued carrying the episode with their own advisory language about outdated racial content and discrimination. It's also worth noting that this wasn't even the first time the episode had been altered for broadcast. Reports from years earlier indicated that Cleese himself had agreed to have some of the Major's most offensive lines edited out for a television rerun back in 2013, well before the 2020 streaming controversy, which suggests this wasn't purely an outside imposition but something Cleese had already engaged with directly on at least one prior occasion. So when you put the actual documented timeline next to a title like The Scene That Took Fawlty Towers Off the Air, the reality is both smaller and, honestly, more interesting than the myth. No network canceled the show. No episode was banned outright and kept off screens permanently. What happened was a 5-day period in June 2020 where one specific streaming platform removed one specific episode while it figured out how to handle a genuinely difficult piece of decades-old content, followed by that episode returning with a warning label, the same solution multiple other platforms had already been using. The show's actual ending, back in 1979, had nothing to do with controversy at all. Cleese and Booth chose to stop at 12 episodes on their own terms, even while their marriage was ending during production of the second series, because they felt they'd said what they wanted to say with the format and didn't want to stretch it past its natural life. None of this means the underlying debate isn't real or worth having. The Major's dialogue in The Germans is genuinely difficult material by any modern standard, and reasonable people can and do disagree about whether decades-old satire that puts racist language in the mouth of a clearly foolish character still lands the way it was intended to, or whether the discomfort of hearing those words spoken aloud outweighs the satirical framing around them. That's a legitimate conversation about how comedy ages, and it's one that has come up repeatedly with other British sitcoms from the same era, several of which were pulled from streaming platforms around the same time in 2020 for similar reasons. What isn't legitimate is flattening that nuanced, temporary, well-documented episode into a story about the entire show being taken off the air, because that framing erases both the real history of how Fawlty Towers actually ended and the more precise, more interesting truth about what happened to one single episode 45 years after it first aired. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. When a joke is built entirely around making a bigoted character look foolish, does the satire hold up on its own? Or does the discomfort of the language itself eventually outweigh the intent behind it, especially decades removed from the context it was written in? And separately, is a warning label paired with continued access the right way to handle material like this, or should platforms be making tougher calls about what stays up unedited? Let us know where you land in the comments, and if you're interested in more deep dives into the real stories behind classic British comedy, subscribe for the next one.